Some people believe destiny arrives with perfect timing, but sometimes it comes disguised as a stranger in the middle of a storm. 12 hours from now, Vincent Castellano would be standing in the pouring rain, holding the woman he couldn't stop thinking about, wondering how a single accident had rewritten every rule he had ever lived by. Just hours earlier, they had been complete strangers. Manhattan disappeared beneath sheets of cold October rain as headlights blurred into streaks of gold across the soaked pavement. People hurried past with umbrellas tilted against the wind, too busy chasing trains, meetings, and warm apartments to notice the young woman sprinting toward the intersection. Ava Carter pulled her thin gray coat tighter around herself, one hand gripping the strap of her worn canvas bag, while the other shielded a folder of housekeeping schedules from the relentless rain. She had just finished a 12-hour shift cleaning luxury apartments on the Upper East Side, and missing the last express bus would mean another hour getting home. Every minute mattered when rent was due in 4 days, and her grandmother's prescription needed to be picked up before the pharmacy closed tomorrow. She whispered a quiet apology as she hurried between the crowd, never realizing another life was moving toward hers from the opposite direction. A sleek black SUV rolled silently to the curb beneath the glow of an expensive hotel entrance. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door with practiced precision. Vincent Castellano emerged wearing a charcoal overcoat that fit him as naturally as confidence itself. At 36, he carried the kind of quiet authority that made conversations stop without anyone understanding why. His tailored clothes, polished shoes, and calm blue eyes belonged to a man who had built an empire through discipline, patience, and impossible decisions. Those who worked for him knew never to mistake his silence for weakness. Yet tonight his attention was elsewhere. A phone call from his aging mother had lingered in his mind during the entire drive. She had sounded lonely again. It was a feeling Vincent understood but never admitted aloud. Rain tapped softly against the marble entrance as he slipped his phone into his coat pocket and stepped onto the sidewalk. At that exact moment, Ava darted around a delivery cart, her shoes sliding across the wet concrete. She reached out instinctively for balance, but momentum carried her forward. Before either of them could react, she collided gently with Vincent, sending both of them stumbling a single step. His phone slipped free, bounced once against the sidewalk, and landed in a shallow puddle. Ava's eyes widened with horror. Color drained from her face as she stared at the expensive device lying beneath rippling rainwater. Around them, 2 security professionals immediately moved closer, their expressions alert but controlled. The city noise seemed to fade beneath the steady rhythm of the storm. Ava's heart pounded so loudly she barely heard herself whisper, "I'm so sorry." She expected anger. She expected humiliation. She expected the kind of cold dismissal that usually followed mistakes made by people who looked like her and lived the life she did. Instead, Vincent looked at the frightened young woman standing before him, rain dripping from her tightly curled hair, concern filling her warm brown eyes despite her obvious fear. For reasons he could not explain, the first question that escaped his lips had nothing to do with the ruined phone. He quietly asked, "Are you hurt?" Ava could barely breathe as rainwater dripped from the ends of her curls onto the polished sidewalk. She looked from Vincent's calm face to the phone resting in the puddle and then back again, certain she had just ruined something worth more than several months of her salary. "I am fine," she answered quietly, embarrassed that he had asked about her instead of the damaged phone. "I am the one who should apologize." Vincent studied her for a moment without saying another word. There was no panic in his expression, no frustration, only quiet curiosity. One of the security professionals stepped forward and carefully retrieved the phone, wiping away the rain with a clean handkerchief. "Sir, we can replace it immediately," he said. Vincent gave a slight nod before returning his attention to Ava. "Then there is nothing left to worry about." The simple sentence caught her completely off guard. She had spent years expecting people with wealth to remind her exactly how small her mistakes could make her feel. Instead, this stranger had dismissed the entire incident with a kindness that felt unfamiliar. Ava lowered her eyes. "Thank you, sir." Before she could say anything else, the headlights of her bus appeared through the rain several yards away. She looked over her shoulder in alarm. Missing it would add another 90 minutes to her trip home. "Go," Vincent said gently after noticing the panic crossing her face. "You are going to miss your ride." She offered one last grateful smile before running toward the bus stop, splashing through puddles as the doors opened just in time. From inside the warm bus, she glanced back through the fogged window. The tall man remained standing beneath the rain without opening an umbrella, watching the city move around him as though he had forgotten where he was supposed to go next. Moments later, the bus disappeared into traffic, carrying Ava toward the small apartment she shared with her grandmother in Queens. Vincent finally turned toward the waiting vehicle, but instead of getting inside immediately, he found himself replaying the brief encounter in his mind. Most people who crossed his path either wanted something from him or feared him before a single conversation began. That young woman had done neither. She had only worried about whether he was hurt. It was an unusually sincere reaction, and sincerity had become rare in his world. During the drive home, the city lights reflected across the rain-covered windows while silence filled the cabin. His assistant reviewed the schedule for the following morning. Meetings. An envelope containing unpaid utility bills rested neatly beside the fruit bowl, reminding her that another long week of work awaited. She smiled anyway as she hung her damp coat by the door. Not because life had suddenly become easier, but because one unexpected stranger had reminded her that compassion could still exist in places where she least expected to find it. Neither of them realized that by the following afternoon, fate would place them under the same roof once again, and this time walking away would no longer be so simple. A bright autumn sun replaced the previous night's storm, washing Manhattan in crisp golden light that made every glass tower sparkle as though the city had forgotten the rain completely. Ava arrived 20 minutes early for what she believed would be another ordinary housekeeping assignment. Her agency had called before sunrise with an unexpected opportunity. A long-term client needed an additional housekeeper for a private residence in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The pay was almost double her usual rate, enough to cover her grandmother's medication without worrying about next month's rent. She whispered a hopeful prayer before pressing the elegant bronze doorbell beside a set of towering iron gates. Moments later, the front entrance opened, revealing an older woman dressed in a perfectly pressed navy uniform. "You must be Ava," she said warmly. "I am Eleanor, the head housekeeper. Welcome." Ava smiled with quiet gratitude and followed her through the entrance hall. The mansion felt more like an art museum than a home. Marble floors reflected morning sunlight pouring through towering windows. Fresh white lilies filled crystal vases. Grand staircases curved upward beneath sparkling chandeliers. Every polished surface reflected years of careful attention. Yet despite all the beauty, the house felt strangely silent. There were no children laughing, no music drifting through the rooms, no sense that anyone truly lived there. Eleanor noticed Ava looking around. "Mrs. Castellano prefers a peaceful home," she explained softly. "She has not been in the best health these past few years." Ava nodded respectfully. "I will do my best." Before Eleanor could continue the orientation, the distant sound of measured footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Ava turned instinctively toward the entrance hall. Her heart nearly stopped. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, was Vincent Castellano. The same calm blue eyes met hers with unmistakable recognition. For one long moment, neither of them spoke. Ava felt the color leave her face. Every memory from the rainy sidewalk returned at once. Surely he would remember the phone. Surely he would tell someone she was careless. Perhaps this wonderful opportunity had already ended before it truly began. Eleanor glanced between them with visible confusion. "Mr. Castellano, this is our new housekeeper." Vincent remained silent for another second before offering the slightest smile. "We have already met." Eleanor looked surprised. Ava lowered her eyes immediately. "I am very sorry about yesterday, sir." Vincent slipped one hand into his coat pocket and answered with the same calm voice she remembered from the ring. "Yesterday was an accident. Today is a new day." The simple words lifted an invisible weight from her shoulders. Without another question or unnecessary comment, Vincent continued toward the front entrance where his driver was already waiting. As he passed Eleanor, he paused briefly. "Please make sure Miss Carter has everything she needs." "Of course, sir," Eleanor replied. The front door closed quietly behind him. Ava remained standing in the enormous hallway, still trying to understand what had just happened. She had expected judgment and embarrassment. Instead, she had been shown grace for the second time in less than 24 hours. Eleanor smiled knowingly before handing Ava a small set of polished brass keys. That was unusually thoughtful of him, she admitted. Perhaps this house has been waiting for someone exactly like you. Ava settled into the rhythm of the mansion more quickly than anyone expected. She moved through the grand halls with quiet confidence, treating every room with the same care she would have given her own small apartment. She polished antique wood until it reflected the afternoon sunlight, arranged fresh flowers with gentle attention, and always paused before entering any occupied room, believing respect could be expressed through the smallest habits. Eleanor noticed those details almost immediately. "You work as though someone taught you that every home deserves love," she remarked one afternoon. Ava smiled softly while folding freshly pressed linen. "My grandmother always says that people remember how a room made them feel long after they forget how it looked." Those words lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after the conversation ended. The person who quietly benefited the most from Ava's presence, however, was not Vincent. It was his mother, Margaret Castellano. Since losing her husband several years earlier, Margaret had gradually withdrawn into a life of routines and silence. She spent long mornings in the sunroom overlooking the garden with untouched books resting on her lap and cups of tea that often grew cold before she remembered to drink them. Ava never tried to force conversation. Instead, she paid attention. On her third morning, she noticed Margaret looking toward the piano in the corner without ever walking over to it. Later that afternoon, while dusting the room, Ava gently pressed a single key before quietly playing a simple jazz melody her grandmother used to hum while cooking Sunday dinner. The music floated through the house like a forgotten memory. Margaret slowly looked up from her chair. A faint smile touched her face for the first time in weeks. "I have not heard that song in years," she whispered. Ava stopped immediately, worried she had overstepped. "I am sorry if I disturbed you." Margaret shook her head. "You reminded me of happier days." From that morning forward, little things began to change. Ava learned that Margaret preferred chamomile tea instead of black tea after dinner. She discovered that the older woman always smiled when fresh lilies replaced the roses in the dining room. She quietly adjusted the curtains each afternoon so warm sunlight reached Margaret's favorite reading chair without shining directly into her eyes. None of those gestures appeared extraordinary on their own. Together, they slowly brought warmth back into a house that had grown accustomed to silence. Vincent began noticing the difference during his evening visits. The staff laughed more often in the kitchen. His mother stayed downstairs longer instead of retreating to her bedroom before sunset. Soft piano melodies occasionally drifted through the hallways as daylight faded beyond the windows. One evening, he paused outside the partially open sunroom door. Ava sat beside Margaret, carefully helping her sort through a worn box of old family photographs. They smiled over faded vacation pictures and laughed quietly at a childhood photograph of Vincent covered in chocolate cake on his 5th birthday. Ava listened far more than she spoke, giving Margaret space to remember stories that had remained trapped inside her for years. Vincent did not interrupt. He simply watched from the hallway, surprised by how naturally this young woman had accomplished something no amount of wealth, expensive care, or carefully planned schedules had managed to restore. The mansion no longer felt like an empty monument built from marble and glass. For the first time in a very long while, it felt unmistakably like a home again. The changes inside the mansion became impossible to ignore as the weeks quietly passed. Even the morning sunlight seemed warmer as it spilled across polished hardwood floors, catching the fresh flowers Ava replaced every other day with careful hands. The staff moved through their routines with lighter hearts, exchanging genuine smiles instead of hurried nods. Eleanor often caught herself wondering whether one person could truly change the atmosphere of an entire home. Looking around each evening, she no longer questioned it. Vincent noticed the difference more than anyone, although he rarely admitted it, even to himself. His days remained filled with board meetings, charity events, and endless decisions that demanded absolute focus. Yet every evening, he found reasons to return home a little earlier than usual. At first, he convinced himself it was because his mother seemed happier. Then he blamed his curiosity about how the house had become so peaceful. Eventually, he stopped searching for excuses altogether. One rainy Thursday evening, he stepped through the front door carrying a folder of documents after a particularly exhausting day. Before anyone greeted him, the comforting aroma of homemade chicken and vegetable soup drifted from the kitchen. It was the same recipe his late father had requested every autumn for nearly 20 years. Vincent paused in surprise. "Who made that?" he quietly asked Eleanor. "Miss Carter found the recipe in your mother's old cookbook," Eleanor answered with a smile. "Mrs. Castellano mentioned she had not tasted it since your father passed away." Vincent remained silent for several seconds before walking toward the dining room. His mother sat at the table with healthier color in her cheeks than he had seen in years. Across from her, Ava carefully poured tea while listening to another family story with patient attention. She laughed softly at something Margaret had said, not because she felt obligated, but because she genuinely enjoyed hearing it. The sound echoed gently through the room, filling a silence that had once seemed permanent. Vincent did not interrupt. Instead, he stood unnoticed in the hallway, watching a scene that felt strangely unfamiliar. His house had always been beautiful. Now it felt alive. Later that evening, after dinner had ended, Ava carried a tray toward the kitchen when she noticed Vincent standing beside one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. She hesitated before speaking. "Would you like some tea, sir?" He turned toward her with the same calm expression she remembered from the rainy sidewalk. "Only if you are already making some for yourself." The unexpected reply caught her off guard. "I usually wait until my work is finished." Vincent gave a small nod. "Then I will wait as well." A few minutes later, they found themselves sitting across from each other at the quiet breakfast table with steaming cups of chamomile tea resting between them. Outside, gentle rain tapped against the windows while the rest of the mansion settled into peaceful silence. They spoke about simple things. Ava shared memories of helping her grandmother grow herbs on a tiny apartment balcony in Queens. Vincent admitted he had once wanted to study architecture before family responsibilities changed his path. There were no discussions about wealth, business, or social status. Only two people discovering unexpected pieces of each other's lives. When Ava finally stood to clear the cups, Vincent watched her walk toward the kitchen before quietly realizing something that unsettled him in the gentlest possible way. For the first time in many years, he had completely forgotten to check his watch. Time had slipped away without pressure, without obligation, and without loneliness. As he looked toward the softly lit kitchen where Ava hummed another familiar jazz melody while washing two simple teacups, Vincent understood that the walls around his carefully guarded heart had begun to crack long before he ever noticed they were there. A few days after their quiet evening over tea, the comfortable rhythm inside the Castellano mansion began to change in ways Ava could not fully explain. It started with little moments that seemed almost accidental. Vincent would arrive home just as she finished arranging fresh flowers in the foyer. He would ask whether his mother had enjoyed lunch, then remain for another minute asking about the garden or complimenting the scent of the lilies she had chosen. Sometimes he left a newly purchased music collection beside the piano after hearing Margaret mention an old favorite artist. Other evenings he returned with fresh herbs from a neighborhood market because Ava had once mentioned that basil always reminded her of her grandmother's tiny balcony garden. None of the gestures were extravagant. They were thoughtful, quiet, and deeply personal. Ava noticed them all, and that was precisely what made her uneasy. She had spent years building invisible boundaries between herself and the family she worked for. Professional kindness was expected. Personal closeness was dangerous. It often led to misunderstandings, disappointment, or painful reminders that people from different worlds rarely walked the same path for very long. One afternoon, while trimming roses in the courtyard, Margaret joined her beneath the warm autumn sunshine. The older woman smiled knowingly before speaking. "My son has not smiled this often since he was a young man." Ava lowered her eyes toward the flowers. "He has been very kind to everyone lately." Margaret gave a soft laugh. "Do not underestimate your influence, my dear." Ava quickly changed the subject, unwilling to let the conversation drift any further. Later that evening, Vincent found Ava carefully organizing books in the library. The golden light from the fireplace danced across the shelves while rain clouds gathered beyond the tall windows. He stepped inside carrying a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. "The owner insisted I try their cinnamon rolls this morning," he said. "They reminded me of something you mentioned your grandmother used to bake." Ava accepted the bag politely, but hesitated before opening it. You remember things that people say. Vincent answered with complete honesty. Only the important things. The room fell silent. Ava looked toward the fireplace instead of meeting his eyes. She appreciated his kindness more than she wanted to admit, yet every thoughtful gesture made the distance between their lives feel even greater. He belonged to a world of influence, privilege, and endless opportunity. She belonged to early morning bus rides, careful grocery budgets, and secondhand furniture that carried years of family memories. Finally, she spoke with gentle sincerity. Mr. Castellano, you have always treated me with respect, and I will always be grateful for that. But I hope you never forget that I work here. That is where I belong. Vincent remained still, absorbing every word. There was no anger on his face, only quiet disappointment mixed with understanding. Is that truly where you believe you belong? He asked softly. Or simply where life has convinced you that you must stay? Ava did not answer. She could not. Instead, she excused herself and quietly walked toward the kitchen, leaving Vincent alone beside the glowing fireplace. For the first time in years, a business negotiation would have been easier than understanding the silence of one gentle woman. As he watched her disappear beyond the doorway, he realized that winning someone's trust required far more patience than earning power ever had. The conversation beside the fireplace stayed with both of them long after the room had grown quiet. Ava returned to her routine with the same professionalism she had always shown, but she became more careful than ever to keep a respectful distance. She arrived before sunrise, completed every task with quiet excellence, and excused herself politely whenever Vincent entered a room. It was never coldness. It was self-protection. She believed that the kindest thing she could do for both of them was to preserve the boundary she had spent years learning to respect. Vincent noticed the change immediately. The casual conversations over tea disappeared. The spontaneous smiles became gentle nods. Whenever he found a reason to ask about her day, Ava answered with warmth, but never with the personal stories she had once shared so naturally. For the first time in his life, Vincent realized that influence could open doors, but it could not persuade someone to lower the walls built by years of hardship and humility. One Saturday morning, Margaret invited Ava to accompany her to the mansion's greenhouse to help repot several orchids that had belonged to Vincent's late father. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, filling the room with warmth despite the cool autumn air outside. As they worked side by side, Margaret quietly asked, "Are you avoiding my son?" Ava paused with a small gardening shovel in her hand before offering an honest smile. "I am trying to protect something that deserves respect." Margaret looked at her with gentle curiosity. "And what is that?" Ava carefully brushed a little soil from the edge of the flower pot. "His reputation, my dignity, and the peace this house has finally found. Sometimes caring about someone means refusing to make their life more complicated." Margaret reached across the table and softly squeezed Ava's hand. She did not argue because she understood exactly what those words had cost her to say. That evening, Vincent returned home carrying tickets to a charity concert after remembering Ava mentioned months earlier that her grandmother loved live jazz music. He imagined surprising both women with a memorable evening together. Instead, he found Eleanor waiting quietly in the foyer. "Miss Carter left an hour ago, sir," she explained. "She said her grandmother was not feeling well, so she wanted to spend the weekend at home." Vincent looked down at the unopened envelope in his hand. It was the first thoughtful gift he had ever chosen without considering its price. Suddenly, it seemed strangely unimportant. The following Monday, Ava returned to work exactly on time. She greeted everyone with her usual kindness and immediately began preparing breakfast for Margaret. Vincent watched from across the dining room, unsure whether to interrupt. Finally, he walked over and gently placed the concert tickets on the kitchen counter. "I thought your grandmother might enjoy these," he said. Ava looked at the envelope for a long moment before carefully sliding it back toward him. "That is very generous, but I cannot accept something so personal from my employer." Her voice remained calm and grateful, making the refusal even more difficult to hear. Vincent accepted the envelope without another word. As Ava quietly returned to arranging fresh fruit on a serving tray, he finally understood that her greatest fear was not rejection. It was losing the self-respect that had carried her through every difficult season of her life. Standing silently in the bright kitchen, Vincent realized that if he truly hoped to earn a place in her heart, he would first have to prove that he valued the woman she was far more than the role she filled inside his home. Several days passed with an unspoken understanding settling quietly over the mansion. Vincent stopped searching for excuses to speak with Ava, not because his feelings had faded, but because he had finally understood that genuine respect sometimes meant giving another person the space to choose freely. He greeted her with the same kindness he offered everyone else, thanked her for every thoughtful detail she brought into the house, and never again placed her in a position that might make her feel uncomfortable. Ava noticed the change almost immediately. There were no more carefully chosen gifts waiting on the kitchen counter, no unexpected invitations, and no lingering conversations that stretched long after dinner. Strangely, the distance she had fought so hard to create left an emptiness she had never expected. The mansion was still warm with laughter. Margaret continued smiling more often than she had in years, and every room remained filled with quiet peace. Yet something invisible seemed to be missing. One Friday afternoon, Eleanor handed Ava the following week's schedule. "Mrs. Castellano has encouraged everyone to take Sunday off," she explained. "She says families deserve time together." Ava thanked her and folded the paper into her bag before boarding the subway toward Queens. As she stepped onto the familiar streets near her apartment, dark clouds gathered overhead, and within minutes the sky opened with another steady autumn rain. She smiled to herself at the coincidence, remembering the stormy evening when everything had unexpectedly begun. Pulling her coat closer, she stopped beneath the awning of a small neighborhood bakery to wait for the rain to soften. Through the front window, she watched families sharing warm drinks, elderly couples laughing over pie, and children pressing their hands against the glass while choosing desserts. The simple happiness inside felt comforting. At that same moment, only a few blocks away, Vincent had decided to spend the afternoon without drivers, assistants, or carefully arranged schedules. For the first time in years, he wandered through the neighborhood surrounding the community center his family's charitable foundation quietly supported. Margaret had reminded him that morning, "If you wish to understand someone, learn to walk where they walk." Those words stayed with him as the rain gradually soaked his overcoat. Passing the bakery, he noticed a familiar figure standing beneath the awning. Ava looked up at almost the exact same moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then they both laughed softly at the remarkable coincidence. "It seems the rain keeps introducing us," Vincent said with a gentle smile. Ava glanced toward the falling drops before looking back at him. Maybe it simply gives busy people an excuse to slow down. They stood side by side watching the rain without the walls of the mansion surrounding them. There were no uniforms, no household schedules, and no expectations. They were simply two people sharing the same quiet afternoon. Vincent noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry several grocery bags across the wet sidewalk. Without hesitation, Ava stepped forward, offered her umbrella, and helped carry the bags all the way to the nearby apartment entrance before returning completely soaked but smiling. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply did what kindness asked of her. Vincent watched silently, his heart growing lighter with every passing second. At last he understood what had drawn him to her from the very beginning. It had never been a single conversation, a chance collision, or even the warmth she brought into his home. It was the quiet way she cared for people when she believed nobody was watching, and standing together beneath another autumn rain. Vincent realized that if fate had truly brought them together twice, perhaps it was asking both of them to begin again on equal ground. The rain slowly faded into a soft mist as Vincent and Ava continued walking through the quiet neighborhood, neither of them rushing to end a conversation that no longer felt uncertain. They spoke about ordinary things that somehow carried extraordinary meaning. Ava described how her grandmother had taught her that true wealth was measured by the number of people who felt safe in your presence. Vincent admitted that he had spent most of his adult life believing success meant protecting everything he had built, only to discover that protecting people mattered far more than protecting possessions. For the first time, there were no titles standing between them, no grand mansion, no carefully maintained distance. There were only two hearts finally speaking with complete honesty. A week later, Margaret invited Ava to join her for afternoon tea in the sunroom. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the lilies that Ava had faithfully replaced every few days since arriving at the mansion. Margaret looked at her with the same warmth that only a mother could offer. My husband always believed a home should reveal the best version of every person who enters it, she said quietly. You have done that for this family. Ava lowered her eyes, humbled by the words. I only tried to care for everyone the way my grandmother taught me. Margaret reached across the table and smiled. Exactly. That is why this house became a home again. Later that evening, Vincent asked Ava if she would take a short walk with him through the estate gardens before she left for the day. The autumn leaves shimmered beneath the golden light of sunset, while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh flowers across the stone pathways. They stopped beside a quiet fountain where the sound of flowing water filled the comfortable silence between them. Vincent looked at Ava with complete sincerity. Months ago, I believed I admired your kindness. Then I believed I had fallen in love with your compassion. Now I understand that what I value most is the person you choose to be every single day, whether anyone notices or not. Ava felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from finally hearing words that honored her character instead of her circumstances. Vincent continued softly. I am not asking you to change your life overnight. I am not asking you to forget where either of us came from. I only hope you will allow me the chance to walk beside you, one day at a time, as an equal who respects you completely. Ava remained silent for a long moment before smiling through grateful tears. The first day we met, you asked whether I was hurt instead of worrying about your phone. That was the moment I realized you were different from the man everyone believed you to be. Today I finally believe you see me as more than the work I do. She gently placed her hand in his. There were no grand speeches, no audience waiting to applaud, and no dramatic celebration. Margaret quietly watched from the sunroom window with peaceful satisfaction, while Eleanor smiled from the hallway, pretending to arrange flowers she had already finished arranging several minutes earlier. Life inside the mansion continued much as it always had, yet everything felt different because the people within its walls had changed. The grand rooms were still beautiful, but kindness had become their greatest decoration. The fortune Vincent possessed remained impressive, but humility had become his greatest strength. Ava continued to carry herself with the same quiet dignity that had first captured his attention, proving that genuine character never depends upon status or wealth. As another gentle rain began falling across the gardens, neither of them stepped away. They simply walked forward together beneath the same sky that had first brought two strangers together. And on that peaceful evening, everyone who knew their story was reminded that the strongest foundations are not built from marble, power, or money, but from respect freely given, kindness quietly lived, and love earned through humility.